I am quite proud of this new drawing of mine. I hope you like it as well, as I comment in details how I made House Face, for lack of a better name. Well, hello there, I'm Detroit. It's time for me to start a new project in digital art. If you've followed my work for some time, you should know that I love picking up on new art styles. In fact, I don't think I have more than 3 or 4 drawings ever made in the same style ever when it comes to digital art. But recently, I've had trouble finding new art styles to explore. Art styles that are actually achievable, to be fair. I have a relatively good understanding of my own flows and where my skill set ends, and some types of art are simply a bit too much for me right now. And so I thought, instead of looking for something new and exciting, why not pick the simplest thing I can? Simplify digital drawing to its most basic components. And so for this drawing, I forced myself to draw line art, clear lines with thin strokes of a circular brush. In fact, no fancy brushes at all, only the basic tools you can find in any digital art software like Clip Studio, Krita, Photoshop, Procreate, and so on. And so since this piece wouldn't be really original in its style, it had to be in its concept, in the subject represented. My imagination is my best quality, and I'll never be humble about that. At any given time, I can picture dozens of good ideas for drawings. Because a drawing can be incredibly well executed, if it's boring, it doesn't really matter, people move on quickly. To grab a viewer's attention, you need a good concept. Or to draw a hot girl, that also works. But sadly for you, today I'm doing the former. I'm drawing a fun concept. Imagine somebody, but their head is a city. But the city is weird in that its perspective doesn't make sense. And so when you try to understand how it works, it doesn't, and you keep looking at it. That is my goal, so people don't move on too quickly when they see my art. So let us doodle a face and add buildings on top. I want eye-catching details, so I don't want the buildings to be too similar to one another. Think about it this way. If you draw 10 houses, but they're visually similar, people look at the first one, then the second, but it's basically the same. Then they just glance at the third and nothing pops up. A quick scan through later and they're done. They're not looking at the 10 houses. Now, draw the second house wildly different from the first. And suddenly people want to see all of them by fear of missing out. And so we have all sorts of buildings with all sorts of roofs and windows. Some buildings are viewed from above, others from below. Some start right in front of others, and some are weirdly hanging from nothing. Apart from the 2 towers in the front, the blending of the buildings and the head is cleverly hidden by strands of hair from the androgynous character whose head I decapitated. Now, for a more mathematical approach to this drawing, I figured I should quickly mention the overall shape I was going for. When you look at the silhouette, I basically broke the overall shape with small elements just so it wouldn't be boring. On the bottom right, there's the face with the chin, nose and eyebrow going out. Then, instead of just having the flat faces of the building, I chose to have a slanted roof and a couple of hair strands to break these boring parts. Similarly for the top, having different angles for each roof to make it more interesting, with the big middle building off-center to avoid symmetry. As for the left side of the silhouette, the back of the character's head, since the hair strands are in a big clump of tendrils, I consciously made the leftmost building more linear, with only the door breaking the flat line. This way your eye isn't constantly assailed by stuff breaking the silhouette, but it's still interesting enough that you want to look. A great tip to make a good sketch and nice shapes is to often flip the canvas so you can see the areas where it's boring or interesting. And with a strong concept, a strong silhouette and a good sketch from which to base yourself on, you can start working the line art. As I said at the top of the video, I wanted to go back to the basics with the style. Simple line art with a full opacity brush, no size pressure change, a default round brush shape. To ink, I made a new layer on top of the sketch and reduced the opacity of the sketch so that I can still barely see it, but it's easy to differentiate with the new layer. And now it's go time! I start with the easiest places, where there isn't too many lines, not too much details, and the lines that are crucial for the whole piece, i.e. the face. If the face doesn't work, then there's no point going further, you can revisit the sketch and so on until it works. Here, it worked well, so once I did the face and the neck, only then could I start inking stuff like hair. Talking about the hair, I really wanted to simplify the whole thing, even if it meant losing realism in the process. So I kept my wrist loose and just went with the flow, drawing S-shaped strokes and then filling them in with quick flowy lines. Drawing a lot of abstract art really helps for that, to keep your lines free and dynamic. For the inking, I usually like to keep the canvas somewhat big to avoid unnecessary details. You can see why when at some point I end up erasing some hair strands because I zoomed in too much and started detailing it with lines that were way too dense. Now, because I kept the original sketch rather simple, especially for the buildings, I'm constructing my line art on many different layers. Whenever I'm in doubt about the lines I'm about to draw, I can create a new layer and draw on it. For example, making a new building behind the one I just drew. I can draw it all and then erase where the lines extend too far and so on. I also make new ink layers when I start getting in some details like brick textures or wooden beams from the roof. If it happens to be too much or too dense, I can erase it later without risking compromising the whole building. Other than that, inking takes time. There's no escaping it. Out of the 5 full hours it took me to draw the whole thing, inking took 2.5. That's half this drawing just inking. The sketch was about 30 minutes, the coloring an hour, and the final details and touches took less than 30 minutes. Be patient, keep drawing, and don't forget to zoom out and flip your canvas frequently to avoid mistakes. And when you're done inking and you're satisfied with the level of detail you have, it's time to add in some colors. One way or another, the first step of coloring is always making flats, which means the base palette before any shadows or highlights or any rendering. To do that, it's important to select the proper area to color. But because here I have the skin, the buildings, the hair, and so on to color, instead of drawing the areas and filling them with color, I'm going from big to small and first selecting the whole silhouette. Basically, at this point, I use a combination of drawing around the silhouette, keeping within the lines, and digital tools like the magic wand or the automatic bucket tool. It doesn't matter how you do it, the goal is to just have the whole silhouette clearly defined on one layer. Usually I would then make clipping mask on top of that layer and color this way, but I learned of a very cool tip from Naka on YouTube, which by the way served as inspiration for parts of this video. So instead of working with clipping masks, I'm going to make a folder and give it a mask, and then select the silhouette I just drew in, which you can do with Ctrl-click on the layer picture, and fill that in on the mask. What that will do is work its magic on all the layers inside the folder, only showing what falls inside the boundaries of the mask. So basically I can use bold gradients and stuff and it won't go outside the line art. Plus, all my coloring layers are neatly organized in a folder now, which is clean and nice. So that's for the base coloring. To be fair, after doing that, you still have to go in and manually draw in or select the areas that will be of a specific color, like the roofs in red and the hair in dark blue here. My tip for that is to start big and then go to the smaller areas with layers underneath the previous one instead of on top. That's to avoid having to draw the edges precisely every time. I realize I didn't mention the background, but obviously at this step of the drawing process, you should take the background into account. Here I'm keeping the background real simple, just one flat color. I made it a desaturated teal or green because it would make the very saturated peachy orange skin tone pop out even more. The teal is calming and cold while the orange is very strong and eye-catching. It's just color theory to be honest, but I thought I would mention it. And when you're satisfied with your flat coloring with each area of different color on a separate layer, we can move on to the next step. This is maybe the quickest step. Just for the sake of variety, I'm gonna slightly adjust a couple layers and give them tiny variations in terms of hue. Like the buildings. I'm gonna make sure the buildings in the back are slightly darker and less saturated, just so they bring the focus to the foreground a bit more. Similarly, I'm gonna switch the color of the roofs around to make the wood more interesting with 3 or 4 hues instead of just one for every wood part. I mostly do that with color layer styles, as clipping mask on top of the flats. To make sure I pick the right tones, sometimes I will add a filter on top of the whole drawing to turn it to grayscale. This allows me to see the values and make sure they are coherent, not just the hue. Because sometimes it's easy to get carried away and simply use the color layer style, but it doesn't change the saturation or the brightness, which you should absolutely take into account to properly change the tone. And now that that's done, it's time to get dark, real dark. Not gonna lie, this step, adding the shadow, is gonna be like 90% of my rendering process. It's gonna bring the whole mood to where I want it. As you may see, for every step of the drawing process, I usually first do a testing pass, where I will zoom out and essentially do the whole step but freely, with a wide and rough brush. This allows me to test the position of the light source, for example, in a couple of seconds, instead of painstakingly taking the time to properly do it, only to realize I wish I'd put the light someplace else. So a couple strokes to see, and yes, I do want my light coming from the left side, so the shadows are gonna be on the right. And now I can go and refine the areas in shadows. Because now I am working with more and more colors and hues, and I'm gonna zoom in quite a bit, I'm employing the pink trick to draw the shadows. And what is the pink trick, you ask? Great question. In my planned artwork, there is no neon pink. So by drawing the shadow in this weird color, I can know where it is at a single glance. Only when I'm done shaping the shadows will I turn the pink into a dark blue multiply layer and lower the opacity. Because that is the easiest way to make shadows in a digital painting. Dark tones on a multiply layer with low opacity. Try it and you'll be sold. Use a cold tone like blue for shadows on a warm picture and vice versa. For the base shadows, this is a rather good way to do things. It's very efficient. Oh, and the technique of shading like this with clear edges instead of gradients and continuous variations is called cell shading, or toon shading if you want to know more. I like to call it big bulky shadow time. Just like the line art takes a really long time but is essential, the shading can be a very tedious but crucial process for a piece. It's only once you have a strong shadow like that you move on to the next step, or steps. In my opinion, there is no set way of doing things now. It's all up to your personal preferences. I'm not saying the touch-ups and the renders you do in this step are less useful, because they will turn a cool picture into a great one and really sell it, but they really depend on what you want to achieve. I'm more of a less is more guy, and I will rarely add wild and crazy digital effects, but you definitely can. Each to its own. Some things I can mention that will often work though: highlights. Just like we drew shadows, highlights can be useful. Use them sparingly and use a light layer style with low opacity like add or pin light or vivid light. Be careful though not to add too many highlights. They can be really distracting and unreal otherwise. Something else that is fun to do for a picture is to play with the second shadow layer. For example, here what I did is duplicate the shadow, turn it from dark blue to dark red, make it slightly bigger than the other and play with layer styles and opacity. It makes this sort of chromatic aberration at the edges of the shadows and emulates a bit how human skin looks redder near the shadows due to subsurface scattering. On other pieces I would play around with blurs as well, duplicating a shadow and blurring it slightly. It's also now the time of your process to revisit your line art if you feel like it. By now, you're so used to a black line art that it feels weird to change, but wouldn't your picture look better if you were to, say, use dark brown instead of black, so that the inking is not too aggressive? You can even change the color of the line depending on what the subject is, to soften it. For example, I could have made the hairline art dark blue, but I didn't. I preferred brown. And finally, in the last steps of the rendering phase, one thing you have to play around with is curves, like the tone curves in the correction layers. I am still very new at this. I prefer to manually adjust the way things pop and look using a combination of clipping mask with layer styles and opacity variations, but curves are the way to go to adjust the overall look of a piece. For example, if you find your piece popping out too much or not enough. And once you're done, well, you're done. You can now sign your art, export it to a PNG or whatever format you like, and post it on social media to rack up the cloud currency of your choice. For example, my work can be found and appreciated on Instagram, Twitter, and Kara. After you've liked this video and subscribed to my channel, of course. It's been a while since I did an exhaustive drawing process tutorial like this, and I hope it served its purpose and taught you a thing or two. Tell me in the comments if you have any question, or if you want to see a specific drawing or tutorial in the future. I'm Detroit and you'll see me around. Bye!